What I'm going to share with you this morning actually is something I learned in Africa about 5.5 years ago. I visited our Agape staff members there, talked with a lot of European American Agape staff members, and I saw there that there was a communication problem. When Europeans went to Africa, they were equipped in Agape training to get adjusted to the African culture, and they had a clear goal, and they went there, and yet they had a communication problem. But that communication problem was not mainly between the Europeans and Africans. Amazingly, that relationship functioned well, but the problem was surprisingly between the Europeans and Americans. The Europeans did not go to Africa with the attitude of getting adjusted to Americans. Their mindset was to get adjusted to Africans, and the Americans did not go to Africa to get adjusted to Europeans. And then suddenly they realized that the most painful communication problem was between Americans and Europeans, because they were not equipped to meet with each other, to work together. There was an assumption that because we are mostly white, and most Americans who came over to Africa, they had somehow European background anyway. They were white people whose forefathers had moved from Europe to America sometime, and we assumed the similarity of culture and all of that will work well, and yet suddenly we realized that it was not so. And there were painful situations, very painful. And I would like to talk about that aspect between Americans and Europeans mostly. But I think some of the principles which I'm going to talk about can also be widened and applied to situations between Europeans and Africans and between Europeans and Europeans. During this time in Agape training, you have already realized that all Europe is not the same. It's not only the multitude of languages, but it is a multitude of cultures and different communication patterns. When I say what I say here, actually there's one precondition which I would like to hammer down and burn into your hearts, and that is never use what I'm going to say against another brother or sister. You get some tools which you could use to torture another person if you want to, but please don't. I come back to the attitudes then at the end of this. And that's the only precondition for you. Use it for people and not against. In my talk, I overgeneralize in many issues. When I say the Americans, you may feel that, do I really believe that all Americans are the same? They are not. I just take some general trends, understanding that there are wide differences. When I talk about Europeans, I'm not assuming that all Europeans are the same. Actually, my Europe still basically consists of Finland and my own roots and my own culture, and Germany, where I have lived almost 14 years now and learned to know the German culture a little. But there are wide areas of European cultures where I'm still so much a foreigner that I haven't found the soul and the heart of those Europeans, especially because they don't communicate with me using their own language, and I cannot speak my language, so we need to communicate in a third language, and that already creates a subculture which hinders us from understanding each other. But so please understand that. Also, when I talk about problems, it's good to know that all problems of the world, and even in Agape ministry, don't come from cultural differences. Not at all. I think most problems come simply from sin. And some other issues, illnesses and loneliness and so on. So the problems which I am going to talk about cover only a part of the problems of Agape staff members. I would basically like to contrast what I know about Europe with the American in this talk, and choose only about 5 areas which I'm going to cover. There would be a lot more, like the concept on time, which I'm not going to cover. But Americans, Swiss and African people all have a different concept on time. The Africans don't say we start the meeting at 9, they say, you know, when we all are together, let's assume that it's 9 o'clock. And they start when everybody is there. People is more important than time. In America, sometimes meetings start punctually, but they never end punctually. The starting time may be accurate and the ending time is sliding. In the Swiss culture, they try to keep both of them relatively accurate. And so, time is another matter, but I just forget that. I forget issues like self-image, which might be good. It's fun to read, for instance, development review forms written by people in Europe who come from different cultures and how they evaluate themselves. In some cultures, like in American culture and some Latin cultures, people tend to rate themselves very high. They always think that if I'm okay, I deserve the top marks. There are cultures like Korea, Japan and Finland where people tend to rate themselves very low. They always feel that they don't deserve to exist at all. You may have heard a joke about an American and a German and a Finn who once saw an elephant, and each of them said just one sentence when they saw the elephant. The American said, "Oh, I wish I would know how to make money with it." And the German said, "I wish I knew how to use it for productive work." And the Finn said, "I wish I knew what he thinks about me." So, you see, there's a self-image difference between the cultures, but I'm not going to get deep into that either. The first area which I would like to cover is a method of discussion, because very often the way we discuss causes problems between people. What are the problems? Let's think about Americans discussing. I have drawn a picture upon an American discussion. It looks like this. One person says something and it's always a question. It ends with a question mark. You know, how are you this morning? What have you been doing lately? It's always a question. The other person is not expected to give a profound, long answer. Just say, "Thanks, fine. What about you?" It's not a question. It ends with a question mark. And so the Americans, when they discuss, they throw the ball to each other through questions. And the topic goes deeper and deeper until they feel that now they have exhausted the topic and the person who says something does not ask a question anymore. And so they change the topic and go somewhere else. One of them asks another question. "What do you think about this?" It functions very well when two Americans discuss. They master the art of asking simple questions. What happens when two Finns discuss? It's like this. One Finn says something, shares something from his own heart, but does not end that with a question. He just stops. And then the other Finn shares something, how he feels about the issue, and then the other responds, and they go forward exactly the same way the Americans do, except that they don't ask questions, or they ask very few questions. They ask questions if they don't understand. What do you mean with what you said? And the questions of Finns, they start with why instead of what do you think about this, or how, like American questions. This method of discussion functions extremely well where two Finns discuss, because they work according to the same codes. They understand, yes, he expects me to share something, and I do it, and when I stop, I expect him to share something. But what happens when an American and a Finn meet? It's like this. The American says, how are you this morning? And the Finn feels, oh, he's interested in how I feel, and then he gives a 10 minutes long, profound answer analyzing his feelings, particularly that moment. And then he stops. He expects the American to respond and share from his life. But the American cannot respond because the Finn has not asked the question. There's a 5 seconds long, uncomfortable, quiet moment, and none of them knows what to do. And then the American, because he has been trained to take the initiative, asks another question. And then the Finn responds, gives another 10 minutes long good answer, and stops. And then an uncomfortable silence. Then the American asks another question, and another question, and another question. And the Finn tries to answer. And at the end of the discussion, both of them feel it's an unfair situation. The Finn feels that he has been in a third-degree investigation where he has been pushed to the corner and he has had to share his heart. And the American has taken the advantage of it and has not opened up his heart at all and shared in the same level. And the American feels that it has been unfair because the Finn has taken the opportunity just to talk about himself and has not given the American the same opportunity to do it. So that's a very, very hard, frustrating situation. I have seen hundreds of these discussions taking place and seen the problem, how bad both of them feel. Actually, I was in that trap last Sunday. I met a British couple whom I have known for 25 years almost and met regularly about twice a decade. And so I visited their home. They are experts in asking questions. They have provided us with some of our best group materials, you know, how to lead group discussions through inductive questions. And they are masters in asking very pointed questions which go into detail. You know, what did you think about that meeting on the 26th of March where you spoke about this topic? And then when I answered, they had the next question immediately there. And it took about 25 or 30 minutes when I realized I was in a trap. They asked all the questions and I responded. And their questions were so fast, so to the point, so thought through, so formally perfect, that I was trapped to feel that I am supposed to give all the detailed answers until I decide to break that flow of events and I say, you know, how is your health? Just in between their questions. And so they had to respond and so we started to throw the ball to each other through questions. But it had been a very frustrating discussion if it had lasted about 3 hours and they had asked all the questions and I had tried to answer and both of us had been very frustrated. These situations rarely happen. Now, what should we do? The one thing which I would like to tell to you, please, don't get frightened about this. I talked in the office at Sealbeck's staff meeting about this about 5 years ago. And what was the result? Everybody got anxious. Now we all discuss in the wrong way, yes. And the Americans decided, yes, we will not ask questions. We don't want to push the Finns and the Germans into the corner. And the Finns felt, I cannot share an answer in a deep way because, you know, I'm supposed to discuss this way. And then everybody stopped talking to each other. That's not the answer. The answer is please accept each other as you are. You know, if you are a product of a culture which asks questions, don't think that's the only way, but take the liberty of sharing even when somebody else is not asking. Just break your own pattern and share more. And it's good for us Finns, for instance. It's good to share, but it's also good to learn to ask questions. Not to feel that you offend people if you ask questions. You are not intruding too much into their lives. the reason why Finns don't ask the questions is that they try to be so tactful that they don't enter into a person's territory without getting a permission from them. So they expect people to open up by sharing instead of pushing them to the corner through questions. And that's a cultural norm of tactfulness, which is a little different from some other cultural norms. So this is one of those differences. Talk. Now, the Americans and the Finns are not the only people to discuss. There are others. For instance, a German way to discuss is neither American or Finnish. Most Germans, when they discuss, they have a dialectical approach. You know, you say something, and the German feels that he has to say the other side of the issue. So the two first words are ja, aber, yes, but. And so he says the other side. And so often an American feels very anxious about that, because an American doesn't expect yes, but answers. And they don't expect to get why questions. That is a bit offensive. You know, Americans feel like he comes to see a person and says good morning, and then the other person hits him to the face and says yes, but, and creates a polarization. In a German discussion, that polarization is a very important and rather positive value. In American culture, confrontation is mostly negative value. The word discussion in English actually means that you talk about a topic, you develop it together, go into the same direction. In the German, the word Diskussion actually means almost like a debate or argument in English. There is always that tension when you use the word Diskussion. And so it's again good for Americans to realize that yes, but in Germany is not polite, it is just good discussion. And he needs to say, yes, I heard your part of it, but I think this way. And so this tension continues, and it may be uncomfortable for Americans or Anglo-Saxons generally, but it is not uncomfortable for Germans. Germans tend to be frustrated when there is no such tension in discussion. They feel, you know, we are just wasting our time, it's small talk. And so it's good for Germans to learn to realize that there can be good methods of discussion to develop a topic, even when that tension is not there. But again, let's be ourselves, but when we hear another person talking, let's try to find out how he wants to discuss, and let's discuss rather too much than too little. Another important issue in this whole cultural adjustment are the words which you use in discussion. If I again overgeneralize, I would say the Americans use words for impact and Europeans for accuracy. Americans use superlatives. You know, everything is fantastic and tremendous and wonderful. They are positive superlatives. They never say negative superlatives. It's, you know, if it's very good in American language, it is fantastic. If it's very bad, it's interesting. It's not, they cannot say superlatives in the negative way. And that's more a German way. But Europeans tend to define everything, and especially Germans. That's a very accurate language. Often Europeans feel that Americans exaggerate when they talk. I remember I was in my first Campus Crusade conference in my life. It was an Institute of Biblical Studies at Arrowhead Springs, 19 1967. And there was the top speaker of Campus Crusade in North America, John Brown. And I was sitting his first lecture trying desperately to understand American English. And then he came to a certain point in his message and he said, oh, this was the turning point of my life. I took my notepad and my pencil and said, I will write this down. Now I discover his secret. And he shared something, and then I thought it's pretty good, but I really can't understand how it turned his life all around, but I will think about it afterwards. Then I came 5 minutes later to a point in his message where he said, oh, this was the most fantastic discovery of my whole life. And I wrote that down. But then when he came to his most wonderful experience, about the 7th time in the message, I put my notepad and my pen away, because what he communicated to me was he was a liar. You know, a person cannot have so many most fantastic experiences in his life. He was exaggerating. What he simply meant in American culture, which has been contaminated by generations of advertisements, when he said this was a turning point or most wonderful experience, he simply meant that, hey guys, listen, this is important. And that was the only what he really meant. But to me it communicated a lot more because I was striving toward accuracy instead of impact. And he chose his words from American advertising language to make an impact on the audience. And it functioned completely well in an American culture. Like my language functioned well in my Finnish culture. But when you mix those two, again there is a communication gap. I took his words with 100% full value when he meant them to be taken only with 50% value. And everybody else took that only with 50% value, and I was misled. Again, when I talk in an American context, I have learned this in the directors' meetings often. You know, they ask me to give a report of Europe. So in the first years I gave a report. And they felt they prayed for Europe, how so bad there, because report to me meant that I shared what happens, the good things and the problems. And then they prayed that God would free us from problem orientation and something would someday happen in Europe. And I was surprised how fantastic every other continent was, until it clicked and I realized that we came from different cultures. When they asked a report, actually in my vocabulary they asked for an advertisement. And so from that on I decided, okay, they want an advertisement, they just call it a report. And so I stopped telling about the problems and difficulties, which had been 50% of it. And they became so happy because so much was happening in Europe, and they felt that Europe had changed. And it wasn't Europe which changed, it was the communication codes which changed. I had to jump into their communication codes because they felt that sharing negative information was a lack of vision. And I felt that covering negative information was a lack of honesty. You understand those two very clear differences. That's one of the clearest differences between Americans and Europeans. The Americans, they use words like always and never. Europeans say often and seldom. And you know, we feel that Americans lack vision, Americans lack integrity, and they feel that we lack vision. We are the ones to bridge that gap and learn from our side. They are the ones to bridge that gap from their side. And when we learn to know each other, then we find a third culture, a language which functions in the discussion of a multinational group, and it's always somewhere between. Another issue is the issue of leadership. Many Europeans have become anxious when they go to Africa, for instance, and work under an American director. because they realize that directing and leading is different in America than in Europe. For instance, in America, the leader is the one to make decisions. In many European countries, a leader leads his people to make decisions. In America, actually, if you want to be a leader, people come to you for you to make their decisions. Yes, you do this and this and this and this, and then they go away. And sometimes in the Anglo-Saxon culture of Europe, leadership is the same way. In the continent of Europe, often people come to the leader asking the leader's help for them to make their own decisions. I need to make this decision. What help could you give to me? Where does my decision fit in, for instance? Often, those people who work under a leader in an American culture, they are expected to ask the question of how. The leader has made a decision, and the person who works under him can ask, how do you want me to do this? How can I do this? How can I solve this problem? And then they expect actually another decision. Yes, this is the way you do it. The Europeans want to know the reasons for decisions. And the key question is always why. But for an American, the why question is often interpreted negatively. I remember it was the first time in the European Leadership Conference, and that time most of our leaders were Americans. We had ministry only in Germany and Great Britain and Finland that time. And all the team leaders in Germany and Great Britain were Americans. And I was the only European there. And we had a speaker who gave a very, very good talk about something which I don't remember about anymore. But it was very good. I remember how I was interested. I wanted to know more. So I asked a question, a why question, because I wanted to know more, I wanted the reasons, about 7 to 10 times during and after that talk. At the end of that meeting, one of my American friends came to me and said, how could you be so rude to confront that speaker all the time? And I was shocked because I was excited, I was enthusiastic, but the American friend heard that this why question was a confrontation. For me it was only willingness to know more and get the reasons, to see what is behind the surface. The American felt I was negative, and I felt I was very positive. And I really don't know how the speaker felt, but he gave very good answers. But it's good to understand that when you go somewhere and you work under American directors, be careful in asking the question, why? If it becomes threatening, because it may be interpreted to be a rebellious question. When I was in Africa, I had to solve a few situations between Americans and Europeans, where Europeans were considered to be rebellious because of asking too many why questions. And actually may ask too many why questions. If all the apostles had been Europeans, after the Great Commission, instead of doing it, they had asked why, and we would still discuss whether or not it should be done. Sometimes we are. Then, in an American leadership culture, the leader makes a decision, but then he separates the motivation and control from the decision. So the decisions are made very quickly. An American leader makes hundreds of decisions a day, easily. He's a decision-making machine. European leaders tend to come to consensus. They bring a group together and they discuss issues very thoroughly and finally they come to a decision. Now they make few decisions, and it takes a long time and a painful process to make a decision. But in the same package with the decision, there is already a motivation, because that whole discussion has created goal ownership. And there is a control, because everybody knows the reasons. And so they know how to function, and they don't need to come back for advice all the time. So an American spends little time in decision making, more time in motivation, and most of his time in controlling, because he makes decisions quickly and easily. The Europeans spend a long time in decision making and need to spend much less time in motivation and controlling. And at the end, both of those ways function pretty much equally effectively. American leaders want fast solutions, and it's difficult for them to live with unsolved problems. Europeans make less and slower decisions, and they can live with problems. That is also often a problem for our Europeans. I meet people from introverted cultures like Finnish culture, where you learn to know with a problem so well that you really don't have the need of solving it anymore. And Americans often feel that any solution is better than no solution. And so a wrong decision is better than no decision. And there's a lot of mistakes which are being made, which have to be changed afterwards. And a European feels that decisions need to be good. And until we find a perfect decision, let's not decide at all. And sometimes things get stuck because of that. Again, the end result in both ways is pretty much equally good, depending on the person. But when we bring people together from different cultures, it is good to understand this. Then another key issue, very much a key issue, is the issue of relationships. Americans come from a melting pot of different nations, people who immigrated into America. And they had to communicate with each other. And so any communication in America is better than no communication. Therefore, the goal is to have many acquaintances. In many European cultures, people don't want to have a lot of superficial acquaintances. They want to have a few selected friends. That's a big difference. In American relationship, the level of commitment is lower. You have many less deep